Has green politics put the United States electrical grid on the brink of disaster? That's going to be our topic tonight on From the Stacks with our special guest, H. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute. Before we get into that, let me just give a little quick introduction to the topic itself. Nearly 200 people died when the Texas power grid, lost power and failed in the February record-breaking cold snap. A major cause of the grid's failure was overdependence demanded by government policy on renewable energy from wind and solar. The results would be many times worse if the same thing happened to one of the three major power grids covering the rest of the 48 contiguous states. The Heartland Institute's Sterling Burnett joins us tonight to discuss his recently published article, U.S. Power Grid, a Government-Induced Turning Point. Tune in, stay with us, and after you see this, let your elected officials know what you think about how our power grids need to be powered. I'm Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We are a network of evangelical Christian scientists and economists and theologians working to promote biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor around the world, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, all of these tied together. And every month, as our way of saying thank you for when people make a donation of any size, we offer to send a free resource, educational resource. This month, July of 2021, we're offering to send you The Climate Blame Game by William Matt Briggs. Dr. Briggs is a statistician, particularly a weather statistician, a brilliant man, and he puts together the statistics to show that the various claims that this or that or another extreme weather event, a hurricane, a drought, heat wave, tornado, whatever, wildfires, should be blamed on human-induced global warming. The statistics just simply don't bear it out. This is a wonderful, concise, very clearly written study, something that you'll want to read and then share with your neighbors who are confused about these matters. So if you would like to have a free copy of The Climate Blame Game, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and then as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in promo code 21-07 or the title of the publication, The Climate Blame Game, and we'll know what you're asking for and we'll send you a free copy of this so long as our supply lasts. Don't delay too long. This offer ends at the end of July, at midnight on the last day of July. So do hope that you will act fairly quickly on this. And by the way, Matt Briggs, the author, will be our guest next week, Lord willing. He's on the program with us, and that should be a fascinating conversation. Well, meanwhile, we have a fascinating conversation coming up for us right now with Sterling Burnett. Sterling is a good friend of mine, has been for, oh goodness, probably a decade and a half, 2 decades. And we probably got acquainted a good deal before that. But Sterling has recently written an article on the fact that the U.S. power grid is being pushed toward a tipping point that could be very dangerous for us. And we have published that on the Cornwall Alliance's website, as well as it having appeared on the Heartland Institute's website. And there you're seeing some background about Sterling, and really fine fellow. He's a Heartland Senior Fellow on Environment, and he does a whole lot of work on climate change and energy and climate policy and the like. So I'm delighted to have Sterling on with us tonight. Sterling, welcome.
Good to be back on.
Thanks for joining us tonight. and we're going to just kind of walk through your article and
Yep.
hit some high points to it. You start off by saying that modern society is heavily dependent on electric power. Our power systems were designed by competent engineers and operated by skilled staff. That would seem to me to just be a pretty obvious thing. If you don't have a power system designed by engineers, you're likely not to have a very effective power system. But what we're seeing now is the interference of politicians with the engineers on the design of a power grid. And I'm not sure that very many politicians have an awful lot of expertise in energy engineering.
That's precisely correct. The more politics intervenes in our electric power markets, the less reliable and the more expensive they become. Um, uh, Politics can't trump physics. And when you replace the goal of reliability, which is the primary goal, or historically has been the primary goal of electric power system, and affordability, which has been a close second, with other goals established by politicians having nothing whatsoever to do with reliability or affordability, then you get what we see in California every summer in the last decade, maybe a little longer. It's increasing. It's getting worse every year. And sadly enough, in my home state of Texas, in the past year, we finally we finally reached the tipping point. And not every summer in Texas we have that's normally our peak use, and power systems are set up to respond to the peak use. But we had a peak during the winter, and we weren't prepared. And when all the politically appointed, politically designed power went offline, uh, I was in a blackout for most of 36 hours. My pool froze over, my pipes burst because the pool pump wasn't working. It was a nightmare.
Yeah, it was a nightmare for an awful lot of people in Texas.
Yep.
Over 150 some people were died during that, and there was tremendous trouble for all sorts of folks there. Um, Sterling, you wrote that as political considerations have increasingly trumped basic physics and engineering, electric power failures have become more common in the past couple of decades in the US. Uh, what political considerations are doing that? Uh, what kind of
Well,
politics?
primarily concerned about climate change. They're
Mhm.
concerned that 100 years from now, people who will be much richer than us, might have to pay cost of modestly higher seas, uh, GDP that's modestly lower than it otherwise would be,
Let me
possibly.
interrupt you on that.
Yep.
Let me interrupt you there, by the way, because your qualification on that is, I think, really, really important. You said GDP that is modestly lower than it otherwise would be. And what it otherwise would be is several times higher than it is now. In other words, average income for Americans would be several times what it is now. Average income for people in today's less developed countries would be 5, 6, 7 times what it is now, according to the forecasts of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In other
Yep.
words, people at the end of this century will be much, much richer than people are right now, even with climate change, even with the worst scenarios of climate
Yeah.
change put out by
Under the
the
worst.
IPCC.
That's right. Under the
And
worst
if that's the
scenarios.
case, a slight reduction in that still leaves them multiples richer than we are. And if riches enable you to solve problems, well, they'll be a whole lot better able to solve problems than we are.
Well, more importantly, they'll be wealthier now. They'll start gaining wealth now. So people who,
Faster.
in developing countries, people are less concerned about coastal properties 100 years from now. They've got to feed their starving children today. They've
Right.
got to educate their children and put roofs over their heads and have clean waters for their kids and wives and husbands today. They want modern healthcare systems now, not 100 years from now. And these climate policies threaten to retard their development. It will keep them poor longer than they have to be poor. And so they won't be as well off. Future generations won't be as well off as they otherwise would be. Whereas in developed countries, yeah, our growth will still more than double, go up to what 250% by 2100, and the costs of climate change, all these terrible costs of climate change, it's estimated that in 2095, absent climate change, GDP will be what it would have been in 2100 otherwise. So we're talking about a 2 to 5% loss in a growth of GDP of over 250%. So they're destroying a modern electric grid now in the hopes that 100 years from now, and trying to prevent a very modest, if they're right, by the way, if they're right about all the harms that will come, if they're right, a very modest decrease in wealth 100 years from now or 80 years from now.
Decrease in wealth, not compared with today's, but compared with what there would be without the policy at the end of the century. So
that's right.
They will still be much, much richer. Now, that's, I think, crucially important to keep in mind. Now, you also write that the replacement of weather-independent sources, that is, sources that really are not affected much by weather, of electric power, coal, natural gas, and nuclear, with intermittent variable wind and solar power, will cause a decline in grid reliability. How is that? Why should wind and solar reduce the reliability of the grid?
Well, for the very obvious reasons that they depend on the weather. Coal plants work as long as I've got coal in there and I keep them maintained. And they work on backup with diesel generators so that when they're taken offline for maintenance, they're still producing power. They're not reliant on whether the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, and within the right speeds and without rain or night, little things like nighttime. Natural gas plants, same thing. As long as you got a pipeline bringing gas in, you've got power. Nuclear plants, so long as you keep restocking nuclear fuel, you've got power. It doesn't matter what the weather is doing. It doesn't matter whether it's nighttime or there are clouds, and they can be placed wherever you need them. You don't have to place them where it happens to be convenient for the weather, for the wind to blow regularly, for the sun to shine regularly. I mean, solar in Alaska is a horrible idea. Now, it's true that Alaska gets sunlight for a couple of months of the year, almost 24 hours a day, but it also gets a couple of months a year where it's dark 24 hours a day. So you're just not going to have power if you rely on solar.
And even in the middle of an Alaskan summer, though you've got sunlight almost 24 hours a day, it's at such an oblique angle that it doesn't give good solar energy anyway. The farther north you go, the farther south you go, in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, the worse solar performs.
Solar does.
Now, I had to ask the question, even if it was a little difficult to keep a straight face when asking it, because the answer seems to be so obvious, and yet obviously for an awful lot of politicians, the answer isn't all that obvious. They just don't seem to get it. When the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you don't generate electricity.
But it's because they're not engineers. They don't understand how a modern power grid works. So I think they think it works on pixie dust and pipe dreams. That so if they can imagine it working, It's like
Sterling, I'm
Stephen.
not an engineer. I'm not an
Well,
engineer. But I
yeah.
get
Well, there you
this. I
go.
mean,
There you go.
and the
Yeah.
vast majority of the American people ought to be able to grasp this with no great difficulty. I think maybe there's something that just kind of automatically happens as you become a politician and get elected to higher and higher office. It's kind of akin to the Peter principle that says that in business, a man is, a person is advanced to the level of his incompetence, right? Well, I think maybe what happens is that as politicians get elected to higher and higher office, their ability to think through things like this just automatically declines.
I'm not
Well,
sure that's the case. I think what it is. I think to be fair, they get to higher office and they have more and more people they can blame when their grand schemes go wrong because it's never their fault. When Texas's power system failed this past winter, the Texas legislature held hearings. No legislator was willing to say, "Yeah, we shouldn't have voted in that mandate to have ever more wind and solar power. We shouldn't have allowed tax breaks to build ever more wind." No. It couldn't be the wind and solar that we required. It had to be something else. It was all ERCOT's fault, the regulatory agency's fault for not doing something. Uh, and the fix also that they proposed had nothing whatsoever to do with uh, solving the increasing use of wind and solar power in our system. Now, recently, just last past week, Greg Abbott, our governor, issued an executive order saying um, wind and solar has to pay for its intermittency. It required ERCOT to keep reliable power plants open and make wind and solar plants power pay for it, which is what they should have been doing all along.
that's a smart move.
I want to just point out, right now it's the electric power system, but the entire course, it seems to me, of human civilization has been decreasing humankind's um, abject weakness in the face of nature. Uh, Less developed societies, primitive societies, used to pray to the gods, please let it rain. Maybe they give sacrifices, hoping that good weather would come, human sacrifices, animal sacrifices. Um, Over time, we've developed modern technologies that make us less and less um, uh, vulnerable
Dependent.
to the vagaries of climate and weather.
Mm-hmm.
And in one generation, politicians are taking us back to the days to where we need to pray to gods that our power system doesn't fail.
Yeah. Yeah.
50 years ago, we didn't have to do that.
Right.
They've actually destroyed
Well,
a working power system, and not just here, but in Europe as well.
yeah. Let's turn now to getting into not quite into the engineering, but into sort of the basic concepts of what a power grid needs. You've written that a large scale power grid consists of two segments: baseload power and peaking power. Define those two terms for us. They're not things that I think most consumers of electricity typically think about.
Baseload power is the amount of power that needs to flow through the electrical system to service everyone on demand power 24 hours a day in a normal working day. So, and the power system, the grid, these wires that you're showing pictures of right now, works with a fairly constant flow of power being regulated and running through them. The farther away from where you have to locate the power generating source from where the power is used, you lose power along the lines. So you have to have a constant flow of power 24 hours a day for normal operations. That's called baseload power. Peaking power, on the other hand, is what happens in Minnesota in the middle of winter, or Texas typically in the middle of summer, when all of a sudden in Texas we turn on our air conditioners, or in Minnesota during the winter January, they turn up their heaters, or North Dakota, they turn up their heaters. So they need an extra amount of power brought online than they do normally. Now, baseload power works if you have reliable power sources. And historically, this has been coal-fired power plants, nuclear power plants, more recently natural gas plants, but they've only become a factor in the last 20 years for the most part. And
Mhm.
hydropower plants in the Northwest, where you have, and some in the Northeast, Tennessee Valley, where you have large scale hydro projects. But and peaking power has been provided by natural gas, because basically you can deliver natural gas on demand, and you can turn on a natural gas plant on demand, which is when you need peaking power. Constant flow versus emergency need.
Yeah,
Now, wind and solar don't satisfy either of those sources of power.
because they are so intermittent. You can't do them for base load because you can't keep the whole total amount of power steady, and you can't use them for
Well, that's part of
peaking
it. You can't keep
because
it
you
steady. So,
can't be sure that it's going to be blow, the wind's going to blow or the sun's going to shine at the moment that everybody turns on the air conditioner, right?
well, that's why they can't be peaking. Yeah, and but even for baseload power, for days at a time, we know wind turbines don't turn, and for days at a time, you have storms, and of course, at night, it's just black. You're not generating power, even for baseload power. But even when they are generating baseload power, I wouldn't call it baseload. It's just supplementary power that we're substituting for
Yeah,
reliable power. Even when they're doing that, as you say, it's not intermittent; it's variable. So
right.
turbines turn and go up and down based upon the wind speeds. The sun, solar power comes based upon clouds passing. And to regulate that amount of power, they have to keep other power plants online, other sources of power online, but working at inefficient levels, because they're constantly ramping up and down. You can't just flick on a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear plant. They have to be running. But if you've got a lot of wind coming in, they're not feeding their power into the system. So they're
Yeah.
running at inefficient levels. That costs us.
Uh,
It's like having a car that goes to the grocery store, but also having another car running constantly,
in your garage.
just idling unless you need it because your car didn't start that day. You can't turn it off, but
Yeah.
so you got it constantly running idling. That's not efficient.
Not at all. Yeah. Now you do mention that for peaking power, in recent decades anyway, natural gas has become sort of the standard provider of peaking power. And you say that that's partly because natural gas plants can be built to scale. What do you mean when you say built to scale?
Well, they can be built. Any power plant can be built to scale, but natural gas plants are the cheapest to be built to scale, which means we anticipate having in Texas, let's say 400,000 new residents come in. So
Mhm.
maybe we need another 700 megawatts of reliable power to satisfy 400,000 new residents. You can build a 700 megawatt natural gas power plant and supply it pretty readily, relatively cheaply.
And you can know that
Um,
it will generate that
that's
power
correct.
consistently 24/7,
Yeah,
365 without
yeah,
interruption. Whereas if you build wind turbines and solar panels that have the capacity to produce that much power, you
that's
know that
yeah.
they won't always be producing that much power. They'll be producing below capacity.
Yeah, well, almost certainly, and almost all the time, they're producing below capacity. I mean, it, I have written in the past, and I don't know if things have improved in the last couple of years, but a couple of years ago I was writing, and I found that for every 1,000 megawatts of wind and or solar you had to bring online, you needed to build another 700 megawatts of natural gas. because solar plants are about 20 to 25% efficient, and natural gas plants are about 30% efficient. So I mean, they're producing peak power about 30% of the time.
Yeah,
I'm
and
sorry, I
by the
can't
way,
have my
too,
refrigerator or my freezer operating 30% of the time.
and you can't have it operate properly on 30% of the the watts or the volts. I mean,
That's right. That's right.
you'll burn out the motor if you don't
Yeah.
provide the right power to it. Uh, you mentioned that solar tends to work at about 15 to 20% of capacity, wind at perhaps 30-35%. I've seen a number of
And
different
drops off
figures on
quickly.
that.
And drops off
Yeah,
quickly, by the way. They lose efficiency over
it
years
does.
very quickly. A coal-fired power
Yeah.
plant, we've got some that have been operating for more than 50 years. There's not a wind turbine anywhere that's operated more than 30 years.
Yeah, and that coal-fired power plant can still be operating at like 90-95% efficiency 50 years later. That's really crucially important. I've seen figures actually for wind and solar as low as 25 and 10%, respectively. Even in recent stuff, even after recent improvements in their technologies, one of the problems is that what we would call the low-hanging fruit principle, and that is that as we build more and more wind and solar, we're having to start putting wind turbines and solar panels in locations that are not optimal for them because we've run out of the optimal locations.
Yeah.
And what that means is that, okay, if, say, as of 2020, the wind turbines all around the United States were operating at an average, say, 30% of capacity, by 2030, the average might be down to 25%. By 2040, down to 20%. I mean, I'm just throwing these figures out for illustration's sake, but that's the point. We use the best locations first, and then we have to go to the worst locations. So we're going to see solar and wind become less and less efficient over time rather than more and more efficient. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, no, that's not taking into account the improvement in the technologies themselves. Well, okay, in principle, that's correct. But as Don Deers has pointed out in a couple of the books that he's written, and I'm sure you're familiar with Don, Don Deers has pointed out that essentially we've pushed turbines and solar panels to right close to the maximum of efficiency. That is, they're getting about all the photons out of the light, about all the energy out of the wind that's there. Well, you can't get more
The
than what's
engineering
there
edge has been
out.
reached. The engineering horizon
Yeah,
has been reached.
the engineering edge has been reached. So we're going to see that, I think,
And at
getting
great
worse and worse.
and at great cost to wildlife, by the way. I mean, for anyone who
Oh, yeah,
actually cares about the environment, let's talk about wind there for just a moment. Um,
sure.
the ideal locations for wind turbines are locations where the wind blows fairly constantly. It's like Goldilocks. She stumbled into the three bears, and some porridge was too hot, some was too cold, and some was just right. Well, if the winds don't blow often enough, regularly enough, that's not a good site for wind. And if they blow too hard, too often, that's not a good site for wind. People don't realize if wind speeds gust above 40 to 50 miles per hour, turbines shut down. They don't just spin faster and produce more energy. They shut down because you don't want them destroyed because they'll shake themselves to destruction.
Yeah,
So they feather them. So they find the optimal wind locations. Well, that just happens to be, it's not coincidence, uh, bird migration sites. Because
right.
birds aren't flapping their wings the whole time they're migrating thousands of miles. They often get up there and glide for a while. That only works if the winds are blowing pretty good. And guess what? That's where you put turbines. So they're killing thousands of birds a year, including protected species. That if anybody, any other industry did it, they'd be shut down in a moment. They'd be fined huge bucks. But when wind turbines kill a bald eagle or a golden eagle or another protected raptor, when solar panels cover the habitat of a desert tortoise, um, and so no sun reaches the ground any longer, doing the plants that he survives on. That's just too bad. That's a sacrifice we make. It's never been a sacrifice we've ever made with any other industry before. So what happens is they say this is about protecting the environment. We gotta, but it's really destroying the environment, and in other ways too that we could get into. But that's the most obvious way.
Yeah. You have pointed out in your article that taxpayers and ratepayers tend to have to pick up the tab for about 50% of the cost of generating electricity from wind and solar, in order for those generators to make a profit selling electricity into the power grid. And as a result, you point out, dozens of coal-fired electric power plants, accounting for tens of thousands of megawatts of reliable baseload electric power and capacity, have closed down across the country. Now, a whole lot of environmentalists will say, oh, that's a wonderful thing because coal is a really dirty fuel. So why isn't that a good thing? Isn't coal a really dirty fuel, and aren't wind and solar a whole lot cleaner fuels than coal?
Well, two things. First off, modern coal-fired power plants are very clean, and the air quality in most cities is actually nowadays is well above what any threshold for human health effects that's been proven to be harmful. So coal-fired power plants aren't threatening our lives. They aren't spewing out. There was a time when the sky could be blackened by all the coal that was being burned. It was unfiltered. It didn't go through anything. But we've got modern technologies that keep that clean. Secondly, green energy is not so green. They call it green energy, and it's a marketing ploy. It's like calling Greenland in the middle of the Ice Age. The Vikings may have tried to lure some people. Hey, come to sunny Greenland, but it didn't make it a place where you're going to be farming. Well, green energy isn't green just because you call it that. And green energy requires technologies, a lot of materials that are not very green in how they are produced or transported or refined, rare earth minerals that you have to tear up large chunks of the earth to get small amounts of, and that you then have to refine using water. And they do these places. Typically, it leaves us more dependent on China and other places for our energy, because that's where most of these things are produced. They control the supply. But the places around the plants that the mines and the refining plants look like Mars landscapes. And the people's health is not good, and the environment is not good. And trying to dispose of the waste from these things is not good. And if you've ever had, and we've got a lot of them in Texas, if you've ever seen what it takes, how much concrete it takes to sink a single wind turbine, that's a lot of energy. That's a lot of CO2 emissions. If you've ever seen how many trucks it takes to build a wind industrial facility, they call them wind farms, but they're not farms. They're industrial facilities. Hundreds of turbines. Well, you know what that is? Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles on big rigs transporting heavy blades and the bases, the towers that the blades are attached to, and then servicing these things for all time, until they stop working. That ain't green. there is no energy source, not a
Exactly.
single energy source that is green, if by green you mean having no environmental impact whatsoever. And these
Yeah.
are among the least green because of what they do to the landscape, because of what they do to wildlife, uh, and because of the inefficiencies they introduce to the grid, which means even the power plants that produce emissions in their operations are producing more emissions than they otherwise would because they're running inefficiently.
Yeah. They're running inefficiently because they're running at what is called spinning reserve as
Yeah.
backup should the wind and solar generated electricity fall off. And so, what you need them running at instead is essentially full blast. And that
Yeah.
is very efficient. You get far
It's
more
it's it's the
gigawatts per unit
it,
of coal or natural gas or uranium fed into the system. Yeah. We
it's the
need to
difference
take a
between
quick
the
break
emissions that come
here.
from a. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, going to take a quick break here. I just want to remind our viewers that as our way of saying thank you as a nonprofit organization supported by donations from individuals like you, we, for the month of July, would be delighted to send you a copy of the new study, The Climate Blame Game. The Climate Blame Game by William Matt Briggs, a statistician, a weather statistician, that gives all the information you need to show that there's been no statistically significant increase in the frequency or the intensity of any extreme weather events, that you cannot blame man made climate change for an increase in the number of hurricanes or the strength of hurricanes or the amount of rainfall from a hurricane or anything like that. You can't blame an increase in floods or droughts or in uh, wildfires or tornadoes or anything else. You cannot blame any of these things on man-made global warming. For one thing, because no increase in these things is happening, and for another thing, because there simply is not any clear correlation between global average temperature and extreme weather events. That's something that even the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has admitted in a several hundred pages long special report back in 2012. Well, Matt Briggs gives you the basics on that in a much shorter study here, clearly written, easy for anybody to use. So if you would like to receive a free copy of this, we would invite you to just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and then as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, just write in promo code 21-07 or the title, The Climate Blame Game, and we'll be delighted to send you a free copy of this. 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. I would encourage you to do it well before the end of the month. The offer ends at midnight on the last day of July, but it also ends when our supply runs out. And I can't be certain that the supply will last all the way to the end of the month. So do take advantage of this opportunity. This is something that you'll want to use to help friends and neighbors to understand this same thing, because apparently an awful lot of politicians find it beyond their grasp. Okay, back now to Sterling Burnett and our discussion of his article on the fact that political policy is putting the nation's power grid in significant jeopardy. Uh, Sterling, um, one of the things that you've pointed out here is that, of course, Texas in mid-February, in the extreme cold that happened at that time, very unusual, suffered a significant failure of its whole power grid. What lessons can we learn from that failure? You've described a little bit before some of the causes of the failure. What
Well,
lessons can we take from that to apply to our development, our expansion, our managing of electricity grids in the coming decades?
I think there's two main lessons. First, your power system,
Debbie?
regardless, I'm sorry.
Debbie, that noise is coming up here loudly.
Hello?
Hi. Sorry, I had to mute for a moment, but go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can
Oh,
you not
okay.
hear me?
No, I can, but you said something about noise, and so I quit talking. Um,
Yeah, I
so
was
there's two
muted.
main lessons. There's two main lessons. First, your power system, no matter what the sources of generation are, needs to be weatherized. It needs to be able to operate in extremes of cold or heat, however unexpected. It adds cost to the system to do so, but the consequences of not having it weatherized during emergency situations is so bad, it's so dire that you really shouldn't. It should never be allowed to happen. Secondly, make your power system as invulnerable to weather or climate conditions as possible. And the main way of doing that is not making it more and more dependent on the weather cooperating. Uh,
Right.
if you add more wind to the system, you're guaranteeing your system is less reliable. If you add more solar to the system to the exclusion of baseload power, you're guaranteeing that your system is less efficient and less reliable. And so it's the lesson they should learn is the very opposite of the direction they have been going over the past decade and a half. And it seems like the Biden administration and many um, state houses want to continue going in the future, which is making their power systems ever more dependent on the weather cooperating, which is crazy.
Yeah, yeah. How about California? You mentioned a little while ago that California has been having blackouts and rolling brownouts for well over a decade now. Uh,
Yep.
California's policy has not been identical to Texas's policy by any means. So, what are the
No.
lessons that we should take from there?
Well, California's policy is a concerted policy to get rid of fossil fuels and to rely on other states for power, primarily hydropower, and to hope and pray that it doesn't get hot during the summer. That seems to be their policy, to hope and pray that it doesn't get hot during the summer, which is a really odd thing as they demand in California ever more parts of people's lives be dependent on electric power. So they're requiring more electric vehicles. You got to get rid of those internal combustion engines. So you got to have more electric vehicles. Uh, you've got to cities are banning natural gas hookups for new hookups or not allowing them in new developments. So more and more of the appliances are going to be require electricity. At the same time, they're doing everything they could to the grid to ensure that it will be less able to satisfy the demand for new electric vehicles and for new electric appliances because they're taking more and more baseload power off. And this isn't a new thing there. It's been going on for some time. Texas didn't go quite that bad. They set a minimum for wind that was not a megawatt hour, but it was just I mean, it was an absolute megawatt demand as opposed to a percentage of the power system wherever that goes. But then they provided all sorts of subsidies for wind and solar through school districts. And so localities are actually destroying the state system because school districts keep granting wind and solar developers because we're all woke in schools, even in Texas. We got to be green, even in Texas. And so some wind developer comes along and says, hey, I'll provide you green power. Or some solar developer says, hey, let me put some solar panels on your rooftop. And they give them a tax credit. They said, okay, we're going to give you a property tax abatement. The state of Texas generously allows us to do that. So taxpayers have to pick up the bill for that. local taxes go up, property taxes go up to pay for that because someone's got to pay for it. The school district's giving an abatement, so the money's got to come from somewhere to make up for the money that's not coming in from these power generators. And once they're online, once they're up there during the summer, the sun's shining high in Texas. We're all going good during the day. Very few storms. Well, they're producing power, not at the capital cost, which is picked up by the taxpayers, but the actual variable cost. Well, there is no variable cost. So they're producing power at less than it costs to sell it into the system. So they can sell power into the system at a loss because of the tax credits they're getting. No other power source can do that. So I'm a power plant. I'm a coal-fired power plant. I'd like to be producing energy, but you know what? I can't sell into the system at zero and negative zero. I'm just losing money. So I shut down. So when the night comes, or when the clouds pass, or when the storms come, and solar ain't generating that power, the grid itself is on the hook. We're letting little bitty localities destroy a statewide grid.
Yeah.
Whereas in California, it's the state that is destroying its entire grid, and they've done it much faster. And so the problem is exacerbated. But let me give a little bit of a warning. This is coming to a power system near you. The power system nationwide, as half the states and the District of Columbia have green energy mandates, wind and solar power mandates, has become less and less reliable. So 20 years ago, you might have had 100 outages across the entire year across the nation. This year, we've had several hundred outages across the nation in less than half a year.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not just Texas. It's not just California. It's coming to a power system near you.
Well, we've drawn some lessons here from a couple different states in America. You also mentioned Germany's Energiewende, the energy transition through which the German government decided to lead its people. And tell us just briefly about the Energiewende. What were the basic ideas behind it, and what have been the results so far for the German people?
They have mandates and feed-in tariffs to bring wind and solar online. They brought a lot of it online. If the government pays for something, they will build it, believe me. And that's what they've done in Germany. Now, the problem is they took off their nuclear power plants after Fukushima in Japan. They've been pushing to get rid of their coal-fired power plants. And so they went from having among the lowest costs in all of Europe for power to the highest cost in all of Europe for power. They are actually having to offload their wind and solar power in peaking periods to other countries at a loss. And then as happened in Texas this year, also happened across Europe, when it happened in Germany, they have outages and blackouts that they didn't have 30 years ago during a cold winter. So their people are suffering, and they're suffering an industrial drain, because companies that can move across borders, corporations that can leave if the power costs get too high, or more importantly, if the power doesn't operate regularly when we have to be producing products, they move to places that are still using reliable systems. And that's what Germany is seeing.
Yeah. You mentioned that the average German household now is paying about 34 cents per kilowatt hour, compared with 22 cents in France and just 13 cents in the United States. So basically, the German households are paying almost 3 times as much for electricity as Americans are because of the Energiewende. That's something that Americans need to keep in mind. I mean, if you really want to go the same pattern that Germany has gone, you need to be all in favor of paying 3 times as much for your electricity. We have a couple of comments.
And 4 times as much, as people are paying in states that still rely primarily, that don't have green energy mandates, that still rely
Right.
primarily on coal, natural gas, nuclear. Um, you know, I pay 9 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are plenty of states like that for the average anyway, around the country, 13 cents per
Yeah.
kilowatt hour. We have a couple of comments, one on Facebook from a fellow named Guy, who says the claim that technology for making wind and solar power is improving, is becoming more feasible, was dismissed by John Couch in his video, Solar/Wind Incompetence. Couch said something along the lines that we're working with technology we don't have. I gather what that means is that Couch was saying, look, the proponents of wind and solar are saying, just wait, we'll get this to you in terms of a truly efficient technology from wind and solar in the future. But the fact is, we don't have it now. Guy goes on to say that while he thinks Couch is wrong on anthropogenic global warming, man-made warming, at least we should give him credit for being consistent in advocating for low-emission nuclear power. And I'll go along with that. Yeah, I think nuclear power is absolutely fantastic, and I wish we had a lot more of it. Unfortunately, a lot of Greens managed to frighten Americans about nuclear power back in the 1970s and early 1980s, and consequently, we've adopted policies that have forced the cost of building nuclear plants through the roof, that have delayed their building tremendously during lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And so we've built practically nothing new, not quite, but almost nothing new since 1980. Gordon Howell, also on Facebook, says we need to get rid of the concept of baseload. Baseload is an antiquated concept that was, excuse me, that was intended to provide the electric system operators a way to manage the incredibly inflexible boiler-based steam turbine-driven thermal electric generators, coal, oil, methane, and also nuclear. Instead, what we need is as much solar and wind as possible, combined with high ramp rate biogas turbines that can provide net load following. Sterling, what do you think of that?
I think if you want a power system that you hope your refrigerator runs 24 hours a day, and you pray the lights come on and your computer comes on when you flick it on in the morning or in the evening, that's you get what you want. There's no engineer on earth I know of that will tell you that we can jettison the idea of baseload power. That person, I
Yeah,
believe, is completely uninformed.
Yeah, I don't see how you can possibly think that. I mean, baseload power basically is this is the power that you need 24/7, 365 under ordinary circumstances when everybody's just drawing the normal amount of power. You got to provide that. If you don't, you have brownouts and blackouts. Peaking power is the added power that you have to provide at those times when people start drawing extra power, when it gets extremely hot and people run their air conditioners more than ordinarily, and those air conditioners have to make a difference between not, say, 85 degrees and the comfortable 74, but 95 or 100 and 105 degrees and the comfortable 74.
And
So that distinction between baseload and peaking power is, I think, absolutely essential to running any grid. And you cannot get all your baseload power from intermittent variable sources. Baseload power has to be constant. And indeed, the more you put into the grid from the intermittent sources, solar and wind, the more unstable the whole grid becomes, and therefore the more backup power you have to have from the stable sources, natural
let's talk
gas,
about his.
coal, nuclear,
Let's
etc.
for a
Go ahead.
moment just talk about his idea for emergency when wind and solar aren't working. His idea is biogas. I can't. There are not enough sources of sufficient biogas in the United States to provide power for all the times the wind is not blowing properly and the sun's not shining properly. And and if we were to try and do that, you'd have pipelines running everywhere to every little farm that has cows, to every you got to have every landfill has to be capped, and and how much gas do they produce? Well, a landfill might produce 2 megawatts of gas a day. That's not gonna replace 700 megawatts of power, even if you
Yeah.
got all the landfills in the Dallas area. Maybe it would provide 50 megawatts of power. It's just
Yeah.
not sufficient. It's not up to the job.
Okay, and I'm fully in agreement with you there, Sterling. We are running right up against the end of the program here. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Sterling, is there something that you would like to say as closing comments? For one thing, include in that, I hope, tell us a little bit about the Heartland Institute and what you do there, because certainly you guys are allies to the Cornwall Alliance. I would like our followers to know more about you.
Well, we've been around for more than 30 years. We work at both the state and federal level, and we promote, innovative private sector solutions to public policy problems. We follow the science, which is data, not models, on climate change. And if you want to know more about our work on climate change or energy, or if you're more interested in things like healthcare or budget and taxes or education, go to www.heartland.org and look us up. You can sign up for my weekly climate change newsletter. You can sign up for one of our newspapers, healthcare news, environment and climate news. You can go to heartlanddailynews.com and see, or .org. I have to check. But Heartland Daily News, either .com or .org, and see our articles on every policy issue with an economic component that you can imagine. And we'd love to have you sign up and become donors if you're already donors to Cornwall. We don't want to rob Cornwall's donor base, but if you can supplement it, that's great. We have a conference coming up. By the way, the big thing is we have a conference coming up in October in Las Vegas, the 14th International Conference on Climate Change. And I think Cal's going to be there as a speaker, and so am I, and so are many, many other scientists and researchers. Be there or be uninformed about climate.
Well, thank you again, Sterling, for joining us tonight. It's been good to have you back on again, and I will look forward to having you on again in the future. Meanwhile, everybody remember that during the month of July, when you make a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance and request it, we will be glad, as our way of saying thank you, to send you a free copy of William Matt Briggs's study called The Climate Blame Game. This shows that you cannot blame man-made global warming for more frequent or intense hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, floods, wildfires, or anything else. The data just simply don't support any such claims. This is something that politicians do all the time. I just today was listening to or watching a video of Democratic senator, I've forgotten now which one, who was blaming all of these things on climate change, and even saying that he thinks that there is a likely connection between climate change and the collapse of the condo in Surfside, Florida, a couple of weeks ago. Tragic, tragic event. It's a terrible event, regardless what caused it, but the fact is that climate change had nothing to do with it. At any rate, to ask for your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and then as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in promo code 21-07, or the title, The Climate Blame Game, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy. As I said, Matt Briggs will be our guest next week on From the Stacks, so be sure to tune in. This is going to be a really fun one. Dr. Briggs is an extraordinary scholar, and I really look forward to introducing you to him and him to you. Meanwhile, go with God, walk with Christ, trust him in all things.